How's it going? Yeah? Wow. Okay. So this is it's a little boomy. Yeah? Is it test 1 2, test 1 2. Test 1 2. That's better. Yeah? Okay, thanks. That was kind of like magic, right? You just jumped in there. Thanks. Yeah. This is Rebecca Solnit from an essay on our president from a few months ago. It's not just on the kind of presidential moment, but on about a lot. And she writes, equality keeps us honest. Our peers tell us who we are and how we're doing, providing that service in personal life that a free press does in a functioning society. Inequality creates liars and delusion. The powerless need to dissemble. That's how slaves, servants, and women got the reputation of being liars. And the powerful grow stupid on the lies they require from their subordinates and on the lack of need to know about others who are nobody, who don't count, who've been silenced or trained to please. This is why I always pair privilege with obliviousness. Obliviousness is privilege's form of deprivation. When you don't hear others, you don't imagine them, they become unreal, and you're left in the wasteland of a world with only yourself in it, and that surely makes you starving, though you know not for what, if you have ceased to imagine that others exist in any true, deep way that matters. This is about a need for which we hardly have language, or at least not a familiar conversation. So when we listen inwards, we're really not just trying to hear ourselves, you know. Like the very gesture of turning inwards in the way that we do, we're trying to hear ourselves, but through that hear the cries of the world. And in beginning to touch into the kind of the poignancy of our own life, we begin to learn something about the lives of others. This is Christina Feldman. Awareness is born of intimacy. We can only fear and hate what we don't understand and what we perceive from a distance. We can only find compassion and freedom in intimacy. We can be afraid of intimacy with pain because we are afraid of helplessness. We fear that we don't have the inner balance to embrace suffering without being overwhelmed. Yet each time we find the willingness to meet affliction, we discover we're not powerless. Awareness rescues us from helplessness, teaching us to be helpful through our kindness, patience, resilience, and courage. Compassion is not a magical device that can instantly dispel all suffering. The path of compassion is altruistic, but not idealistic. We're asked to explore how we may transform our hearts and minds in the moment. The path of compassion is cultivated one step and one moment at a time. Each of these steps Each of those steps lessens the mountain of sorrow in the world. So we'll just sit quietly together. Any excuse me, any questions about your practice?
I'm finding that there's kind of like these little gaps of space that are, I don't know what to call them, that I'm seeing in between noting stuff. And it kind of made me a little uncomfortable when I felt them today. And then I kind of went back to something more familiar, like the breath or listening to sounds, and not get so scared of that little space. But I know it's a good space. I just am not familiar with resting in that area.
Yeah.
And I just let myself note, however, I'm really more into noting my thoughts and feelings and not identifying with them and making them me. So I'm having a little bit of a challenge noting what they are. So I just give them any name. Maybe it's a couple sentences, maybe it's a couple words.
Yeah.
Whatever, just something to get them identified and off me.
Yeah.
Off. That's me.
Yeah.
That sound all right?
Yeah, so just so people can hear, the comment was like noticing certain spaces, but in doing mental noting practice, acknowledging thought and feeling, and then noticing certain spaces that feel promising or onward leading, but also unsettling, and then a kind of question about about using mental noting to kind of get some more space from the world of thought and feeling. So it's fine not to know exactly what we're noting, not to have a kind of well-formed label or something. That's some of the reason why a lot of the kind of mental notes are pretty, like, that I find useful. They're vague. They're like, they encapsulate a lot of different phenomena. So thinking, for example, rather than drilling down in a more descriptive way, or feeling rather than needing always to give it a name or a valence or something. So you might explore actually just using broader categories as ways of noting, and be conscious of the way in which mental notes are not meant to bring experiences to an end or rid ourselves of something, but actually the way you're using them, it's meant to actually drive the attention more fully into the experience, at least until it dissolves. So just be conscious of the way that aversion makes its way in through the back door. And then in those gaps that you're describing, does it feel like it gets kind of quiet or still or something, silent, and then there's a part of you that's like,
no, like I'm supposed to be thinking or
yeah.
But I know that that's not necessarily true.
Yeah.
But I'm just not familiar with that.
Yeah, that's great. There's something about silence that leaves us feeling very undefended and porous. And it's like, at some level, like so much of our like the running discourse of the mind is a way of like, it's like a safety behavior. It's like a constant checking of who we are and where we are and what the threats are and what the opportunities are, and then we drop into some stillness and silence, and there's like, and then it starts to feel like body and mind more porous and like the vulnerability of that, the way in which the world is just touching us moment by moment, like, and we can sense that, sense the undefendedness of that. There's another part of the mind that you know, fear comes up, or sort of we need to reestablish some ground. And I think part of what happens is that some of that silence, that it comes to feel more safe, actually, and there's a kind of trust that we have in that, and there's less kind of fear about being like overwhelmed by whatever may arise. But when you notice that fear coming up in relation to the silence, you can just fold that into the awareness too. So now you're not noting, you know, or just being awake to silence. It's now fear, you know, or judgment, or confusion, or whatever may come up. And so you just keep folding that in, and keep the kind of continuity without a preference that it's for silence versus fearful confusion, you know, which is like a tall order. Yeah. But it sounds good. So yeah. Yeah.
I've been doing a practice of loving kindness and focusing on that. And I'm finding that especially in today's times, especially this last minute, what we did just then, if I do any loving kindness towards myself, I get wrought with guilt and aversion, and I mean, I can't do it. I'll feel like physically sick, and I'll have to move on to loving kindness towards other people and stuff. And I don't know. It was particularly hard this last meditation.
Yeah. So the loving kindness towards oneself, it feels indulgent and sort of.
Indulgent.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah, like I'm not. Like there's a lot of people that need it.
Yeah.
I do, or something like it's just unnecessary for me.
Yeah. Yeah, so the comment of like doing metta for self right now is feeling indulgent, and people need it more. And I would say I would say if it feels like there's a kind of enough well-being to direct the attention outwards, that's fine. Yeah, it's fine to actually. If loving kindness for other beings or compassion practice feels more appropriate now, that's fine. And if it continues to be that way, and you can't in some way include yourself in that circle, you know, that's a point of investigation. Because ultimately, kindness towards oneself is like the foundation for giving to others. Feels uncomfortable, yeah. Is it always feel uncomfortable? It always feels uncomfortable. Okay, well that's a little bit of a different conversation. Yeah. It's so hard to consider ourselves just another person. You know, it's like, that's hard to do, you know, because it's like, no, this is the center of the universe, like right here, and that requires different handling instructions, you know, but it's like, nope, you know, just another human being, you know. And you can explore the ways in which it's like sometimes it's actually like the self-harshness is really actually it looks like it's generating the vulnerability, but you can look for the ways in which the self-harshness is actually a defense against vulnerability, a defense against the porousness of our life and the fragility of happiness and yeah. Let's stay in touch about how that unfolds. Yeah. Maybe one more. Yeah.
Yeah. So I generally just do the breath, watch my breath.
Yeah.
When I meditate. But if my mind is quiet, like it kind of was tonight, I'll do a body scan.
Yeah.
And if I can do that without wandering away, for a little while, I noticed that I get this thing in my stomach. It's kind of like it almost is like indigestion or like gas or something. And it's happened enough times that I know that it's related to that somehow. I'm just wondering if you've ever heard of anything like that. There's no feeling or thought or anything associated with it.
Yeah.
My guess was maybe it's like a somatic something process or something like that.
Yeah. So the comment about getting quiet and then pretty consistently, like in that quiet, certain kind of nausea arises or rumbling, indigestion. Over the years, just in my own practice and also literally dozens or probably hundreds of reports from people of what happens when they start to get quiet. And it's a lot of weird shit. And I've really stopped trying to catalog it or make too much meaning out of it. But the way you're describing it does not it doesn't concern me, and it's quite common for certain there are other people, other teachers who maybe have more elaborate frameworks that to understand things, but I just take it to be a kind of aspects of a certain kind, for lack of a better word, purification, and you don't need to know what it is, or you don't need to trace it back to something or connect the dots or something. It's just you're just gonna love it to death, and
The other thing
yeah.
I want to do is
Yeah.
push through it. It feels like there's something on the other side, but I know that that's not
Yeah.
really what it's about. So
Yeah.
it comes sometimes and then goes.
Yeah, and then do you direct attention to it, or
Yeah,
is it?
well, I mean,
Yeah.
It's kind of like when I do the scan, the more I do that,
Yeah.
more intense the feeling.
Yeah.
But I just do it until my mind goes somewhere else.
Yeah.
That's that.
Yeah. I that sounds like good practice, and you can really focus actually on softening the belly, like making that the anchor of the attention for a while, just softening and see what comes up. And sometimes it's a kind of mysterious process, but my experience is that just over time, it's this is exactly the kind of stuff that happens, and consciousness just starts to be a little lighter, and you don't know where the pain went or what it meant or what it means for your future. It just kind of fades over time, and there's just, you may not actually see the process by which there's a sense of oh, it's a little just lighter being human. Yeah, thanks. Okay. some meditator types who are researchers, like that's their world is research. This is Nicholas Van Dam and Judd Brewer and a few others, and they did this this bit of research that was building on the Buddhist personality types of greed, aversion, delusion. And they actually developed a scale, like a psychometrically validated scale to assess these basic tendencies, right? And so anyway, they write, even at the level of a single-celled organism, behavior must necessarily fall into one of three possible categories. Move towards, approach, move away, withdraw, or neither, no response. These three basic options cannot be reduced further and therefore seem to represent the most parsimonious description of behavioral tendencies. So the simplest you can get without being too simple, basically, yeah? So this maps exactly to what's called, greed, hate, delusion, or greed, aversion, delusion, craving, aversion, unconsciousness. And we become very familiar with these forces of our mind. And so classically it's said greed, I'm going to talk about delusion tonight, but greed walks in the room and sees what you want, like some of the art or whatever. Aversion is like, what's wrong, the acoustics or what, like something's wrong, And then delusion is kind of like not noticing much, yeah. And personality is messy, like it's not, we don't neatly fall into one category, but you may notice an affinity for one of those, yeah? It's sometimes said like, if you don't know which you are, it's probably delusion. But I was thinking, I actually kind of wanted to survey you for like, Jean, myself, Vinny, what do you think we are? No, we're not. No, definitely not. All right, let's start with Lushtag. Greed?
Greed or delusion, yeah, it could be delusion.
Okay. Yeah, I think Gene is definitely not judgmental, and like he's probably more of a greed, a little delusion. Yeah. Me? Hey! This is really fucking fast. Jeez, man. And Vinny? Aversion, yeah. Yeah, he says that all the time. Yeah, he is, yeah. Yeah, so...
It's nice to have teachers that aren't deluded.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, it's said that like there are plus sides on each of these too, but I'm an aversive type, focused on the negative, and so greed is like that gaping hole, right? Of like lack and wanting, and it's like very obvious. And aversion is like the fire, you know, of hate or whatever, or just irritation, yeah. And then delusion. You know, delusion just like feels like the truth, you know. Does that make sense? Yeah. That famous talk from David Foster Wallace, where he's like, you know, he says like, okay, there's like the big fish swimming across and crosses paths with like two little fish, and the big fish swimming by says like, hey boys, how's the water? And the little fish swim on by, and like the next frame, one of the little fish is like, what's water, right? And this is like delusion, yeah? Like, and it has the effect of being like the water that we swim in. And greed, hatred, aversion, like these things actually are like, if we get even a little bit quiet, they're usually register with a lot of clarity, yeah? But delusion is trickier, and we have to almost like look at it sideways. I'll say, you know, more about this. So this is a quote that I often come back to from the book, Being Wrong, Adventures in the Margin of Error. Catherine Schultz writes, most of us go through life assuming we're basically right, basically all the time, about basically everything. As absurd as it sounds when we stop to think of it, our steady state seems to be one of unconsciously assuming that we are very close to all-knowing. If we relish being right and regard it as our natural state, you can guess how we feel about being wrong. For one, we tend to view it as rare and bizarre. For another, it leaves us feeling ashamed. Of all the things we're wrong about, this idea of error might well top the list. We're wrong about what it means to be wrong. Far from being a sign of intellectual inferiority, the capacity to err is crucial to human cognition. Far from being a moral flaw, it's inextricable from some of our most humane and honorable qualities. And far from being a mark of indifference or intolerance, wrongness is a vital part of how we learn and change. Thanks to error, we can revise our understanding of ourselves and amend our ideas about the world. However disorienting, difficult, or humbling our mistakes might be, it is ultimately wrongness, not rightness, that can teach us who we are. We're growing wisdom on the path. We're cutting through delusion. And it's this very kind of patient process. It's like it can't really be rushed. And what I notice in people as they practice, as the kind of months or years unfold, there's this like ripening of the mind and a kind of ripening of wisdom that is the accumulation, I think, of just many moments of seeing more and more clearly, of seeing our conditioning, seeing conditionality. And there's this kind of, certain richness and balance and spaciousness that starts to like infuse the view. And it feels like people are coming both to care more and less about their lives. You know, it's this weird thing where in some ways it's like the preciousness, the urgency of like making good use of whatever time we have. That is like a kind of daily living reality. And at the same time, people like, there's a certain kind of distance or remove from the moment by moment conditions or circumstances of one's life. And so there's so much less attention just like pooled in that. This is like the unfolding of wisdom. And so the question like, okay, how do we do this? How do we actually cut through delusion? How do we work with this mind state that at some level, like if we detected it as delusion, we would put it aside, right? You know, it's like, we just, it's kind of the steady state. We think we're right until we realize we're wrong. Yeah? And so how do we actually discover this and grow in this way? So I want to say something about that. There's first like establishing a certain kind of willingness and humility in the imperfection of our understanding. And that's what the quote from Catherine Schultz is alluding to, that kind of openness to wrongness, openness to learning. And if we have like so much ego invested in being right, it actually undercuts the kind of relentless pursuit of understanding, because we're constrained by our own egoic sensitivities. So there's not that kind of reckless willingness just to look. I just want to see. I want to see. So we bring some kind of humility and hopefully like don't feel ashamed in discovering our own delusion. Yeah. Chris McKenna said, said like, if you want to know your conditioning, if you want to know it, you will. And if you don't, you won't. And there's something about this kind of like, something that happens on the path as the practice starts to seep deeper into one's heart that's just like, man, I just want to know. I want to see. I want to see. You know, it's like a certain kind of fatigue with the repetition and the cyclical nature. And it's just like, even if it doesn't bring relief, I just want to know what the fuck is happening, you know? And there's a certain kind of like, drive behind that. Jonathan Franzen said that the blanket of self-deception, a lovely warm blanket as far as it covered the soul in torment, but it never quite covered everything. So we start in a kind of prosaic way of beginning to like integrate wise view, you know, of like using the framework, for example, of the Four Noble Truths as a way of beginning to understand our life, even if that doesn't feel totally natural to us, even if that's not how we're seeing moment by moment, we start to like use the teachings as a frame for like, we introduce some wisdom into the mind. And so I think most centrally we get like really interested in the distinction between suffering and non-suffering. And that actually helps us cast aside like so much of our moralism and ideas about what we're supposed to experience or supposed to know. And it's just like, yeah, it cuts through like good and evil, and it's like, no, let's focus. The Buddha was like, this is where to attend suffering and its absence, its generation and its dissolution. We start to like recognize the kind of fantasy of a close-hearted happiness, like that of a deep happiness that's close-hearted. That is a fantasy. It's like there's something inextricably bound to like, a bind between the open heart and deep happiness. They're like certain half-baked forms of happiness that we can get away with like a closed heart, but not the deepest kind. We just can't be protecting ourselves and actually be deeply at ease and happy. So it's going to be a porous, receptive, a heart that can be moved easily if we're to be deeply happy. We prepare the mind, making it receptive, like to awaken to delusion. Like there's a way in which just getting quiet is helpful. And you probably all know this experience where something that you've heard like 20 times or like 1,000 times in one of these talks, on one day, just because of the nature of the mind and its receptivity, it lands in a different way, and it has a kind of liberating, maybe little, but just like a flash of some freedom that comes. It's like, that was new. Yeah? And I've heard it forever, but that something was new. Yeah? And it actually cuts through a certain kind of conditioning that we had been living with and not fully recognizing as such. Now, I said that like aversion and greed are more easily discerned, and sometimes they can be, their presence can be a guide to seeing delusion. So, what I find is that often it is delusion that is essentially rationalizing greed and hatred. That makes sense? So like, I was talking to a friend, like beloved friend, and a serious practitioner, and somebody who, like a very subtle mind that can essentially, like, just a persuasive person, and persuasive to himself too, yeah? And there was just a kind of episode of some emotional hurt or betrayal, and then because that was like not fully recognized, what happened was like from that sense of hurt, there was like this birth of this whole elaborate narrative that was essentially rationalizing the pain away, and it was this kind of like, this whole like elaborate view of that justified it was like acting out the hurt in a way, but it was like very subtle and hard to actually see that this whole view was birthed out of that initial pain of betrayal and not actually metabolizing that in experience. And from that, it was like this whole elaborate thing that actually could play out over the course of years. You know, you can live for years in a narrative that has essentially a rationalization of a certain kind of vindictiveness or whatever it may be. And because we actually weren't there at the scene of the injury, right? And so the delusion just like, it looks good, you know, it looks like sensible, and yet it's this production from, you know, from something that was not seen clearly. And then we take birth in that delusion. And this can happen in like big dramatic ways, and it can be subtle, right? But this is why we want to like actually trace back and find like that early moment of like what happened and how is it giving birth to a whole set of ideas, a view, a narrative, yeah. Sayadaw Tejaniya. Understanding that something is not beneficial is very different from thinking or judging that something is not good. If the mind labels something as good, there is craving already. With any object that arises, delusion is already on the scene. Delusion conceals an object's natural characteristics, but not the object itself, and labels it as good or bad. Greed or aversion then do their work of grasping or rejecting. So how are we going to meditate? Meditation is the recognition of gross and subtle forms of craving, aversion, and delusion, and their relatives that are present in the mind when it's observing objects. Sometimes there's a kind of the cue that there's delusion present. There's a certain kind of confusion that reigns in the mind, or ambivalence. And this is different than like the openness of not knowing. You know, like that's a prized element of this path of not knowing, the wisdom of not knowing, the wisdom of like a certain kind of openness and a mind not like intent on forming conclusions. But that's different than the kind of confusion of like a deep ambivalence. And often when we get into that state of some kind of confusion, ambivalence, we just like try to think something to death, you know? And it's like we're just, you know, kind of spinning the same wheels in a way that got us into it. So this is Philip Moffat. From a Buddhist psychological perspective, when you're caught in debilitating ambivalence or ambiguity, your mind is either deluded and clinging to a desire for your life to be perfect, or it's afraid and wanting a guarantee that what you're doing is the right thing to do, or it's refusing to participate in the dance of life due to some conscious or unconscious aversion to uncertainty and potential loss. These mind states begin to limit your capacity to live fully, and you're less effective in meeting goals. When ambivalence is debilitating, your mind is in a flu-like state and reality is obscured. You feel stuck, dissatisfied, restless, or uncertain. In the language of Buddhist psychology, you lack clear comprehension, sampajanya, of what is being called for and how you might respond to that call. So, we are like tracking ourselves to try to like see when that the fog descends on the mind in a way that's subtle, you know. It's like it's not this like immediate arising that's like very evident. The way that a lot of this conditioning functions is it's like this slow moving fog that's like too slow for us to like fully register that we're getting fogged in, you know. And so we can look for some cues. We can like track our arousal level. So sometimes like a cue that we're like in some storm, like there's delusion present, we may just find ourselves hyper aroused or kind of numbed out, flattened, detached in a way. We track our sila, our conduct, and we look for where we're deceiving ourselves or others, you know. Sam Harris, when you give yourself the out of lying, you deny yourself the kinds of collisions with reality that are necessary to improve your life. A commitment to honesty is a mirror you hold up to yourself where you can discover who you are in relation to others and in relation to your moment-to-moment experience. This is a place where like the profound value of like cross-cultural dialogue and exchange and, you know, travel and where we actually get to like, there's something when just in being with people who like see things in a different way, the idiosyncrasies and the weirdness of my own view is like brought into real clear, you know, vision. You know, it's like the way we see just feels natural, but it's actually like so particular to our conditioning. And there's a kind of, beautiful way in which, you know, actually like really feeling into the life of another person who's coming from a different view is precious and brings into to clear, brings into clear view the idiosyncrasies of our own perspective. Something I shared before, but a kind of moment at some point in a retreat with Shinzen Young, and he said, like, there are two maxims of spiritual practice. One, don't fight with yourself at any level. Two, take feedback. Yeah. There are some times where we can do everything we can to try to catch our delusion, and the only way that we just can't do it. We just can't do it. We actually depend on others. And so there's a kind of, a willingness to, and I think of this as a fundamental aspect of our spiritual intention. Like, it's a willingness to use our life as a feedback mechanism. Yeah, where it's like we approach our experience as a mechanism for us to get feedback, and that happens both in the kind of, in the very common sense of the word feedback, where somebody's like, Matthew, that talk sucked, right? For these reasons, right, or whatever. Or like just the kind of, the way we actually just pay attention to our life and like take that as feedback, yeah? Now, to do that, to do that requires a certain willingness to be disoriented, because we're so acclimatized to our view and to delusion itself that to be told you are confused is the experience of real kind of like groundlessness. And we like very quickly try to reestablish the ground and the kind of ordinary reference points of who we are. This happens like all the time in complex discussions around power and privilege, and it's like there's this like immediate defensiveness because the sense of like ground was just like taken out from under us quickly. And so the defensiveness serves this function of like reestablishing the familiarity of who we think we are. But there's a way in which we actually need to tolerate disorientation, like, I don't know. Yeah? And so this is, you know, a kind of, I think of it as a real fundamental capacity of being human, this kind of willingness, because I associate certainty with the potential for violence, you know, and the kind of flexibility of mind that I'm pointing to, I associate with the potential for reconciliation and for understanding. Yeah. And so we're all, you know, we're doing this together. This is one of the functions of Sangha, as we, you know, rub up against each other's conditioning, and we hopefully learn and grow and begin to wake up in more and more spheres of our life. May it be so. Just sit for a minute. I know. Announcements, Jason? Yeah.
Please.
Yeah.
Hey, everybody. We've got